Diane Cusick. Diane Cusick, a 23-year-old woman, resided with her parents in Nassau County, New York. After separating from her husband, she had moved back into their home, bringing her 3-year-old daughter from her previous marriage with her. Diane worked as a dance instructor. On February 15, 1968, after completing her shift at a children's dance school, she called her parents to let them know she was heading to the mall to buy shoes. However, she never made it home. When Diane hadn't returned by that evening, her parents went looking for her. They discovered her car, a 1961 Valiant, parked in the Green Acres Mall parking lot in Valley Stream, New York. Upon opening the car door, they were met with a horrific sight. Diane's lifeless body was lying in the back seat. Her face was bruised, and a 2-inch piece of tape was wrapped around her mouth and neck. They immediately contacted the police. An autopsy revealed that she had suffered facial and head injuries. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. She had defensive wounds on her hands, and police were able to recover DNA evidence from the scene. However, DNA testing did not exist in 1968. Police conducted a massive search of the area and showed Diane's photo to nearly 2,000 people, asking if they could provide any information about her last hours. Police were able to release a description of a suspect seen at a movie theater in the mall shortly before Diane's body was found. Witnesses said that the man was a white male in his late teens or early 20s with average build. They claimed he wore eyeglasses and was at least 5'8" tall. Diane's estranged husband was ruled out as a suspect as he had an alibi. He was working his part-time job as a taxi driver at the time of the murder. Police questioned multiple people, but no leads could be found and the case would eventually grow cold. In 2016, the DNA sample found at the crime scene was submitted to a national database, but no match could be found. Then in 2021, police in Nassau County received a tip that a killer who was responsible for other killings in a suburban county who was currently locked up in New Jersey may also be responsible for Diane's murder. Police ran a DNA test again, and this time it matched the convicted serial killer Richard Cottingham. Cottingham is now 76 years old and serving a life sentence for murdering nearly half a dozen women and girls in New Jersey and New York since he was arrested in 1980 after a motel employee heard the screams of a woman inside his room. Police were called and they found the woman alive but handcuffed and suffering from bite marks and knife wounds. Cottingham would later admit to killing more than 100 women. However, police have officially linked him to about a dozen killings. He was also nicknamed the Torso Killer because he was known for dismembering his victims. Police believe that Cottingham pretended to be a security guard or possibly a police officer, and that he accused Diane of stealing. He then asked her to come with him and overpowered her in a secluded area. Cottingham was working as a computer programmer for a health insurance company in New York at the time of the killings, and was officially charged with Diane's murder. On December 5, 2022, the man responsible for Diane Cusick's murder, along with 4 other women, confessed to the crimes committed decades earlier. He was sentenced to 25 years to life for Diane's death, but he will not face charges for the other 4 murders, as he is already serving a life sentence for previous convictions. Diane's daughter, Darlene Altman, now 58, spoke at a police conference saying, "I never thought I'd see this day. I've given up. But all these people got justice for me and my mother." The case was finally closed after 54 years. Moving on to the next case. Savannah Hoskins. Savannah Hoskins, a 34-year-old woman from Ogden, Utah, was a mother of 5 and married to Joe Hoskins, a man with a violent temper. Their marriage was troubled, marked by frequent arguments, and Savannah had attempted to leave him on several occasions. On July 3, 1985, she was reported missing to the Ogden Police Department. A few days later, residents discovered 2 legs floating in a nearby river. Initially appearing to be white, investigators later determined they belonged to an African American woman. Although it was suspected the legs belonged to Savannah, the limitations of DNA technology in 1985 made it impossible to confirm. No other body parts were found, and because they could not definitively identify the legs, Savannah's husband, Joe, could not be charged. Over the years, the case remained unsolved, and Joe Hoskins passed away without ever being questioned. In 2020, Savannah's children and grandchildren urged the police to reopen the investigation. The police still had a toenail from the discovered legs, which was sent for DNA testing. It was then confirmed that the legs belonged to Savannah. The Ogden Police Department now believes Joe is responsible for her death. In a statement, it was made public that Joe actually made incriminating statements. And with other witness statements, plus the DNA match, all leads point to Joe Hoskins. We are confident based on all that evidence that if Joe were alive today, we would be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe Hoskins took the life of his wife, Savannah Hoskins. The son of Joe and Savannah, Joe Hoskins Jr., who now lives in Idaho, remains skeptical about the findings of the police. "No, I don't believe it," is all he had to say. There's currently a $3,000 reward for any information that could lead investigators to the rest of her remains. They are searching the area again now that they have better technology, but so far they have found nothing. Moving on to the next case. Diane Augot. Technology has revolutionized our world in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. It opens up possibilities for activities such as shopping online, enjoying kitten videos, or staying connected with friends. Yet, in certain situations, it can also be unsettling. Imagine the horror of hearing a loved one's cries during a struggle on the other end of the phone. The anguish of losing a child, accompanied by the haunting sound of their final screams in a voicemail, is a heartbreaking thought. Diane Louise Augot, born on February 21, 1958, lived much of her life in Florida, leading what seemed to be a typical existence. A stay-at-home mother in the 1970s and early 1980s, caring for her 3 children, Diane's life took a tragic turn when she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. This condition led her life to unravel, and after losing custody of her children in 1988 and divorcing their father in 1991, she fell deeper into drug and alcohol addiction, often failing to take her prescribed medication. Over the years, she faced multiple minor arrests. Her mother reported that Diane had been taken into police custody at least 32 times under Florida's Baker Act, which permits a judge, police officer, or doctor to decide if an individual needs an involuntary medical examination. Diane was also known to make poor choices in friendships, often trusting strangers, and could frequently be seen talking to herself. This mix of mental illness and an overly trusting nature may have contributed to her disappearance in 1998. At the time, Diane was staying temporarily with her sister, Deborah, in Hudson. On April 10th, she was seen leaving their shared residence in Hudson. The following day, a witness reported seeing Diane walking north along US 19 near New York Avenue in Hudson. She was never seen again. 3 days later, on April 13th, Diane's mother, Mildred Young, returned home to a disturbing voicemail from her daughter. In the message, Diane was heard saying, "Help, help, let me out," followed by sounds that suggested a struggle, with someone trying to take the phone from her. Diane then shouted, "Hey, give me that," before the call abruptly ended. When Mildred checked the caller ID, she was led to a business named Starlight in the Odessa area. However, when she returned the call, it went unanswered. Further investigation by the police revealed that 6 businesses named Starlight existed within a 45-mile radius, but none were located specifically in Odessa. Some armchair detectives speculated that Starlight could have been the name of an LLC rather than a local business. At this point in Diane's tragic story, many have questioned why Mildred didn't contact the police right away. This is a valid question, but there is no clear answer. Online sleuths have suggested that Mildred might have been used to her daughter's occasional misadventures, likely due to Diane's tendency to skip her medication. This type of behavior may have seemed somewhat normal. Just 2 weeks before Diane's disappearance, she had been in a mental facility for several weeks, and Mildred, along with other family members, believed that Diane should never have been released, as she required institutionalized care. Several days later, on April 15th, Diane's severed fingertip was discovered along the roadside of US 19, near New York Avenue, the same area where she had been spotted on April 11th. The fingernails sported the same coral color that Diane was last seen wearing, and the fingertip was specifically her right middle finger just above the first knuckle. It was located first by a woman, but she assumed it was just a prank and left it. However, after telling her boyfriend that night, he worried that perhaps it was real, and they went to look for it the next day. According to reports, both halves of the couple described the fingertip differently, leading police to wonder if there were multiple fingertips along the roadside, but they only ever located one. The fingerprint from the severed finger matched Diane's criminal record. Also, at some point between 10th April 18th, Diane's house was robbed. It is unknown if this was done in connection with her disappearance, or if it was by local teenagers who knew the house was empty. 2 weeks later, a bag of Diane's neatly folded clothing was found located inside the outdoor freezer of a convenience store where her sister Deborah worked in Odessa. There were some conflicting reports about whether Deborah found the bag herself, but most reports state that her boss found it and then contacted her. As Diane was a regular customer, the store manager was familiar with the clothing and the bizarre circumstances surrounding the 40-year-old's disappearance. Deborah recognized the clothing as belonging to her sister, as she'd recently given the items to her. The freezer had last been checked 3 weeks before the clothing was found inside. In 2000 days later, a clear plastic Ziploc bag was found by Diane's brother's girlfriend, a woman named Terry, who'd gone to her local Circle K convenience store for a drink and some cigarettes. It is unknown how long the plastic bag had been sitting there, but in black marker, the word Diane had been scrawled across the front, and it contained a pink lipstick, black eyeliner, taboo perfume, and a tube of generic toothpaste, the latter being identified as the one Diane was issued with by the mental facility when she was released. While Mildred Young confirmed that the belongings in the bag looked like those that her daughter might have, it couldn't be conclusively proved by law enforcement to have belonged to Diane. There is much debate surrounding the plastic Ziploc bag, with many online sleuths noting the coincidental timing of its discovery, since it was found just 1 day after a local newspaper reported on the story, again gaining some traction. Many believe the family planted the bag there to try and get the case more attention, but there is no evidence of this. Others have proposed that the bag was Diane's and that she'd had it from leaving the mental hospital. The bag and the fact that her name was written on it in marker resembles the kind of thing carried out of hospitals. After 2000, however, Diane's case largely goes cold. Sometime between 11th April 14th and 1998, witnesses placed the 40-year-old at the Coral Sands Motel, which was managed at the time by a man named Gary Evers and his girlfriend. 3 years later, in 2001, Gary was charged with murder after allegedly shooting and killing a man he thought had robbed him. The real robbers were later caught and charged. Although Gary had no prior record in Florida, law enforcement suspects that he might possibly have been involved in Diane's disappearance, but there is no evidence to bring charges against him. In the weeks following Diane's disappearance, there were several witness sightings reported on the DOE network. On April 10th, a bartender at the Hayloft Tavern, located at the intersection of Little Road and State Road 52, believes he served Diane that day. However, he cut her off when her behavior became erratic, as she began walking in circles. Since Diane didn't own a car, it's believed she either went with someone or possibly hitchhiked there. On the 13th, the same day, Diane left her unsettling voicemail for her mother. A waitress at the inn on the Gulf and Hudson reported seeing the 40-year-old dining there. There are a few theories regarding what happened to Diane. Law enforcement suspects foul play, but some have speculated that Diane may have lost her fingertip not from an intentional injury but possibly from an accident, such as a slammed car door. Other online theories suggest that Diane might have chosen to leave her life behind and staged her own disappearance or suicide. However, if that were the case, removing one's own finger seems like an extreme measure. If she is still alive, Diane would now be 62 years old and missing her right middle finger. Her disappearance remains an unsolved mystery. Moving on to the next case. Philip Kahn. On July 24, 2000, remains belonging to an unidentified male were discovered 27 miles off the coast of Maine, near Grand Monon Banks. Fingerprints and DNA samples were collected from the remains. The fingerprints were submitted to the FBI, but no matches were found. The DNA was uploaded to the FBI's Combined DNA Index, yet there were no results. With no leads, the case went cold for several years. In 2019, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner reached out to Parabon Nano Labs to conduct forensic genealogy on the DNA. Parabon analyzed the sample and determined that the man was Jewish, but his identity remained unknown. However, in March 2022, the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services and Deceased Persons Identification Services Division became involved. The unidentified person's fingerprints were submitted for comparison in May 2022. On January 11, 2023, it was announced that the remains belonged to 84-year-old Philip Kahn. The FBI was able to match the fingerprints and dental records to Philip, who had been reported missing in Las Vegas in 2000. His next of kin has been notified of the identification. It was determined that Philip left Las Vegas and arrived in New York City in July 2000. The circumstances of how or why he ended up off the coast of Maine remain unclear. Moving on to the next case. Rose Burkhart and Roger Atkinson. On September 12, 1980, 22-year-old single mother and trainee nurse Rose Burkhart, along with 32-year-old telephone installer Roger Atkinson, attempted to check into the Manor Holiday Inn near Williamsburg, Iowa. However, due to a convention taking place, the hotel had no vacancies and they were turned away. Later in the day, a cancellation allowed them to book a room. Everything seemed normal during their stay, and they did not draw attention to themselves. The following day, however, when housekeeping arrived at noon, something seemed off. The couple did not respond to knocks on the door or the maid's requests to be let in. Growing suspicious, the maid used the master key to enter and found the couple's feet on the bed. Initially thinking they were simply asleep, she looked further into the room, only to be confronted with a horrific crime scene. Both Rose and Roger were dead on the bed of their hotel room. They had sustained fatal head injuries, and Roger's fingers were severed from trying to defend himself from the attack. The huge blood loss and brain trauma endured by both parties were labeled as the cause of their death, with authorities determining that the wounds were made with either an axe or a hatchet. Rose was fully dressed, whilst Roger wore only shorts. The TV was still on in the room, and oddly, 2 chairs had been pulled up next to the bed, leading authorities to wonder if the couple had some kind of conversation with the killer. This, coupled with the fact that there was no sign of forced entry, brought about the speculation that the pair knew their murderer. Further evidence in the room showed that the killer had put his feet upon the desk and carved a bar of soap, using it to write this on a bathroom mirror. A strange clue that has brought no new leads to the case. Over 400 people were interviewed by authorities, including staff and guests at the inn. However, it seems more likely that someone closer to home was involved. A likely suspect in the case was Rose's ex-boyfriend, whom she had kicked out of her home for his drug use. She'd recently taken out a personal protection order against this unidentified man, and bought a dog for protection. One day when she returned home from work though, she found her dog had been brutally slaughtered, and hung up in her front yard. Investigators did look into Rose's ex-boyfriend, but found that his alibi checked out. He also seemed to pass a polygraph test, although this is known to not be foolproof as a method of proving someone's innocence. Another potential suspect in the double murder was Roger's uncle, Charles Ray Hatcher, a serial killer who had escaped from a mental facility in September 1980 but was later recaptured. Despite his history, he was never questioned regarding the murder of his nephew. In September 1980, agents from Missouri and Illinois were brought in to help investigate, and they looked into a similar murder that had occurred just 3 months earlier on June 25th, where a hatchet had been used. Tragically, Roger's father passed away in 2004, and his mother followed in 2012, never seeing justice for their son. One of Rose's closest friends, Tammy Berkman, has worked tirelessly to keep the case alive, even at the cost of her own marriage. As of 2020, the murders of Rose and Roger remain unsolved. Moving on to the next case. Eloise Warlidge. Throughout the 1970s, Australia witnessed several monumental events. The Australian Labor Party came to power, the dismantling of the White Australia policy, which previously restricted non-Caucasian immigration, and the end of the long-standing economic boom that had contributed to the nation's prosperity. Amid these significant changes, a number of mysterious and disturbing crimes occurred, many of which remain unsolved to this day. Eloise Warlidge, the eldest of 3 children born to Lindsay and Patsy Warlidge, was born on October 8, 1967. At the age of 8, she disappeared from her family home on Scott Street in Beaumaris, Victoria, on January 12, 1976. Her case remains one of the most perplexing in Australia's history. When police arrived at the Warlidge home, they immediately sensed that something was off. Eloise's 4-year-old brother Blake had noticed his sister missing around 7:30 a.m. that morning. After a brief search of the property, Patsy and Lindsay contacted the authorities. There were no signs of a struggle inside the house or in Eloise's bedroom, but a small hole had been cut in the fly screen of her window, which was opened as far as it could go, leaving a gap of 38 centimeters. A piece of bark from the tree outside the window was also found on the floor of Eloise's room. Forensic analysis of the hole in the screen revealed it had been made from the inside. The hole appeared to be too small for an abductor to use, and investigators believed it would have been difficult for the perpetrator to leave the house via the window while taking Eloise with them. Authorities determined that the scene at the Warlidge home appeared to have been staged, leading them to believe that Eloise and her abductor had likely exited through the unlocked front door rather than through the window. During further questioning, Blake, Eloise's 4-year-old brother, told authorities he had heard what he described as robbers taking his sister. He was too frightened to speak out at the time, fearing they would take him too. Blake also mentioned hearing crackling noises, which suggested to the police that the intruders had moved around Eloise's room, which had a seagrass floor. Police theorized that Eloise had been lured from her bed by someone she knew and trusted, given her shy and timid nature. Her parents described her as not likely to willingly go with strangers. However, authorities did not rule out the possibility that she was abducted by a prowler who was known to be in the area at the time. On the night Eloise disappeared, her father, Lindsay, had gone to bed about an hour and a half after her. He had been the last one awake, as her mother, Patsy, had gone to bed an hour earlier. The front door had been left unlocked because Lindsay was unaware that Patsy had forgotten to close it. Additionally, a hallway lamp was left on for the children to help them feel secure as they went to sleep. The last parent to go to bed always turned it off. However, on this occasion, Lindsay had forgotten to do so. But curiously, when Patsy awoke at around 4:45 a.m. to use the toilet, she noticed that the lights was off. This led investigators to theorize that by this time, Eloise was already gone. Although there was little physical evidence available inside the family home, authorities were relieved to find an abundance of witnesses around the neighborhood. One neighbor saw a dark green car speeding down Scott Street at 2 o'clock in the morning, while another reported seeing a green Holden station wagon, which she did not recognize, parked near the Warlidge's house. Around this same time, neighbors heard a child scream and a car door slam. One man also reported that his tool shed had been broken into that same night. Then around midnight, another neighbor named and same saw a young man walking down the fence line of the family home. She noted that the unidentified man made her feel so uneasy that she crossed the road to avoid him. Around this same time, a woman named Molly Saltz, who lived a little further down the street, saw a young man jump the fence to the Warlidge property after running in front of her car and across the street. Investigators also discovered that a young man had been canvassing the area over the previous few days, claiming that he was doing a survey on children's education. This man has never been identified, and it is unknown if he was the same man seen the night Eloise vanished. Without any further leads as to the identity of the man or men seen in the area around the time Eloise was last seen, authorities turned to Patsy and Lindsay with their suspicions. Both parents were having affairs and living separate lives at the time of their daughter's disappearance. They had been together for over 10 years but had recently become distant, and both parties sought to dissolve the marriage. The day that Eloise was taken, Lindsay was due to move out of the family home and into his own apartment. Authorities wondered if perhaps he'd done this to stall the moving date and allow him to spend more time in the family home. But ultimately, neither parent was ever linked conclusively to the disappearance. According to a senior constable who was speaking to a news outlet in 2002, Patsy told police at the time that she felt her husband was involved in the disappearance as a means of prolonging the inevitable and as a way of spicing her. However, other investigators who worked the case believed Lindsay only really became a suspect because there was nobody else and no other leads. In 1976, the father of three had offered to take a polygraph test, but he was not taken up on this offer. He was later asked to take one in 2002, but the results were inconclusive. As we always say, it is worth bearing in mind that polygraph tests are never reliable and are rarely admissible as evidence in court. At the time the crime occurred, an extensive search was carried out involving over 250 people. The dog squad, search and rescue, and the mounted branch were just some of the police units involved in the 3-week-long search, but no trace of Eloise was ever discovered. Her body, if she has sadly passed away, has never been found either. A reward of $10,000, the modern-day equivalent of nearly $70,000, was offered too, but none of the leads ever brought in by this incentive ever propelled the investigation forward. Other suspects in 1976 included Patsy's sister and several of her friends, although it's unclear why. When the case was reopened in 2001, they were all dismissed as suspects. Their links to the case were entirely baseless. 1 month after Eloise vanished, a woman named Catherine Marling came forward and told the police that she'd seen a green 1966 model Holden in the street a week before the incident. Authorities believe that the vehicle was the same one which was stolen from Carlton in December of 1975, but the car was never found and the lead quickly died out. Over 100 family members and extended family members were looked into by police alongside over 250 colleagues, friends, students, and acquaintances too, but still the investigation stalled. In 2001, the police revisited the case and examined local sex offenders who were in the area at the time of Eloise's disappearance, including several teachers from her primary school. However, their efforts yielded no new leads, and the investigation stalled once again. Despite concluding that the scene had been staged and that more than one person was likely involved, authorities were unable to identify any suspects or gather evidence connecting someone to the crime. Following their divorce, both Patsy and Lindsay remarried, but neither remained hopeful that the case would ever be solved. Lindsay passed away in February of 2017, still unaware of what happened to his daughter. Patsy, on the other hand, focused much of her time on caring for her grandchildren. The couple's other daughter, Anna, had 3 children of her own. Tragedy struck the family again in 1997 when their only son, Blake, was killed after being struck by a car while crossing the road on a rainy night. The current status of Eloise's case remains uncertain. Given the lack of new leads or updates, it seems unlikely that the investigation is still active. Moving on to the next case. Catherine Janiro. In 1994, 20-year-old Catherine Janiro lived in Barrie, Ontario, Canada, with her 2-year-old daughter, Dawn. On October 10th, Dawn was staying with her grandparents, Denora and Fernando Janiro, in Toronto, leaving Catherine home alone. During the day, a friend knocked on her door but received no response. Concerned, they entered the house and made a shocking discovery in the basement: Catherine's lifeless body. She had been stabbed multiple times. The Barrie police began the investigation but handed the case over to the Ontario Provincial Police in 1999. Despite an extensive investigation, no arrests were made. In 2012, the case was returned to the Barrie police. Investigators noted that they had collected hundreds of pieces of evidence and taken numerous witness statements throughout the years. It is important that every piece of information received is always closely examined. You never know which one holds the key detail you are searching for and will lead your team ultimately to the arrest of the person responsible, said case manager Detective Kevin Scales. In 2014, investigators revealed that they were monitoring 2 men who they believed were connected to Catherine's case. Catherine's daughter Dawn also spoke at the press conference. She told the media how she first learned that her mother's life was taken. When I was 6 years old and my grandparents were distracted, I was flipping through channels and came across the Crime Stoppers episode. The episode was a reenactment of a young woman being stabbed in her apartment. As young as I was, I still remember being terrified and sad for this woman and sad for her family. Moments later, a picture of the real victim holding her child was put on the screen, and I realized at that moment, that was my mother. I knew because it was the same picture that's in my living room to this day. I've never been able to get rid of the hurt and confusion that flooded my mind that night. 7 years later, in January of 2021, detectives arrested 58-year-old Robert Bruce McQueen in connection to the case. Peter Lyon, Barrie police spokesperson, said he was arrested yesterday morning without incident operating a motor vehicle in the south end of the city of Barrie. I think he was surprised. As you can appreciate, 26 years have passed. That's a lot of looking over your shoulder, wondering if today is the day. Well, yesterday was the day, Leon said of the arrest. Dawn said that the arrest had brought her closure. I wish my grandparents, Denora and Fernando De Niro, were alive to see this day. It has been revealed that Catherine and Robert knew each other, but the police did not elaborate further. They also didn't give a lot of information as to what led to the arrest of Robert, just that the arrest came following a tip they received in 2019. On January 21st, Robert made a brief appearance in a Barrie courtroom. He also faces charges of driving while disqualified in August 2020. Not much is known about Robert, except that he spent most of his life in Barrie, worked in construction and various odd jobs, and had a strong passion for shows like CSI and Law and Order. Investigators are also exploring the possibility that Robert may have been involved in other crimes. Moving on to the next case. Morris Davis Jr. In Great Falls, Montana, on April 5, 1985, at around 11 p.m., paramedics were called to a home following reports of a multiple shooting. Upon arrival, paramedic Cliff Davies discovered that his 23-year-old brother, Morris Vernon Davies Jr., had been shot more than 8 times and was pronounced dead at the hospital. It seemed that the motive behind the murder was robbery, as the killer had taken Morris's delivery wallet, but left other items untouched. The wallet contained less than $300. For months prior to the murder, Morris had started working as a part-time pizza delivery driver. Since he was the next available driver that night, it appeared that he had not been specifically targeted. A telephone order had been placed at Hauer's Pizza at 8:43 p.m., and Morris left with the food at 9:15 p.m. When he failed to return, another driver was sent to check on him and discovered the tragic scene. Police found that the local home was actually vacant and that the for sale sign at the front of the house had been removed. The back door had been forced open, allowing the killer access to the building. Since there was no phone service in the house, it was likely that the call made to place the order for pizza was done so from a nearby payphone. Authorities theorized that Morris had been killed upon entering the house, but no suspects could be determined until 3 years later. On May 1988, in a town 180 miles from Great Falls, a man was arrested for driving a car stolen from Oregon 3 days prior. When the unidentified thief was searched, it was found that he had 2 receipts from a pawn shop, with one being a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber that murdered Morris Davis Jr. 3 years earlier. After locating the weapon at the pawn shop, authorities discovered that the pistol had also been reported stolen 3 days earlier. Extensive ballistic testing carried out on the gun showed that it was the murder weapon in the case of the pizza delivery driver in 1985. According to the unidentified man who had possession of the gun, he'd stolen it from a friend several days prior to his arrest, and he denied any involvement in the murder of Morris Davis Jr. Not only this, but the real owner of the gun, who went by Rick in articles of the time, also claimed he knew nothing about the murder and that he had an alibi in the form of him being at home on the night of the crime looking after his son. He told police that only he and his wife knew where the gun was kept, and investigators struggled to understand how someone could possibly know where the gun was, take it, and then return it without its owners being any the wiser. Upon investigating the alibi and the background of Rick, police deemed him not a suspect in the 1985 murder. The only other lead in the case comes from Morris's brother Cliff, one of the paramedics who was called into the scene of the shooting. Cliff initially believed that Rick knew who was responsible, but a more advanced ballistic testing was carried out on the pistol, and it was determined that it was not the murder weapon after all. Cliff then came to believe that the prime suspect in the murder of his brother was a man called Donald DeBray. DeBray had been convicted for the 1986 murder of Suzanne Pritchard, a convenience store clerk who was shot 24 times during a night shift and robbed of $300. Like the murder of Morris, the killing seemed excessive for such a small amount of cash. Cliff Davies contacted DeBray multiple times regarding the murder of his brother, alleging that DeBray had detailed knowledge of the crime scene, such as the location of the shots fired and where the body was found, among other specifics. DeBray reportedly claimed that he was present in the house during the murder but did not pull the trigger. After this information surfaced, police made DeBray a prime suspect, but he passed away in prison in 2016 without ever confessing to the murder of Morris. Despite efforts by detectives to bring closure to the Davies family, as of 2020, the murder of Morris Davis Jr. remains unsolved. Moving on to the next case. Maureen Dutton. England is known for its understated natural beauty, iconic red telephone boxes, black cabs, and its musical legacy, with successful bands like Oasis and the Beatles. Yet, it is also home to numerous eerie mysteries, including a range of unsolved cold cases that have faded over time. One such mystery is the unsolved murder of Maureen Dutton in 1961, which remains one of Liverpool's most chilling and gruesome cold cases. At just 27 years old, Maureen was a typical English housewife. Her husband, Brian, was a research chemist employed by the Imperial Chemical Industries, ICI. Just 3 weeks before her death, Maureen had given birth to their second child, Andrew, while their first child, a 2-year-old named David, completed their small family. By all accounts, the couple seemed to have a happy and ordinary life, making Maureen's murder all the more disturbing and shocking to their community. On December 21, 1961, Maureen spent the entire day at the couple's home on Thingwall Lane in the Knotty Ash area. She had planned to take David to the nearby Childwall Parish Church but decided against taking her infant son, Andrew, because of the cold and dense fog. Instead, she called her mother-in-law, Elsie, asking if she could babysit later that day. However, Elsie had to cancel when the fog became too thick for her to safely make the trip, and so Maureen's plans were cancelled, leaving her at home with her children. She was last seen alive around 1:30 p.m. that afternoon. When Brian returned home from work just after 6 p.m., he immediately sensed something was wrong. The house, usually filled with the noise of 2 young children, was eerily silent. Maureen was always active, juggling household chores and caring for her boys. His suspicions deepened when he noticed their half-eaten lunch still on the kitchen table. Moving into the living room, Brian made the grim discovery. In the center of the room, Maureen lay lifeless, having been stabbed 14 times in her chest, throat, and back. It is widely believed that her young son, David, who was sitting nearby in a dazed state and staring at his mother, may have witnessed the brutal attack. Andrew, the infant, was found in his crib nearby. The 2 children were presumed to have been left alone for nearly 6 hours. An investigation was immediately launched by the Old Swan police station into the brutal murder of the mother of 2. Authorities believed a long-bladed knife was likely used as the weapon and conducted extensive searches in nearby bushes, shrubs, and drains, but no weapon was ever found. Despite their efforts, no clear forensic evidence was uncovered. There were no signs of sexual assault, forced entry, or anything missing from the home, all of which made it difficult for authorities to pinpoint the motive. After carrying out door-to-door inquiries, police discovered that nobody had been seen coming or going from the home, and nobody had heard screaming or a struggle. Then a young woman came forward with an interesting story. After seeing the newspaper reports of Maureen's death, The young woman who lived in nearby Halewood told authorities that she had been visited by a young man who claimed to be a doctor. Like Maureen, the young woman had recently given birth. She assumed that the doctor had been sent to check on her as part of her postnatal care, but this was not the case. After her husband returned from work, she told him that the doctor had indecently assaulted her, which prompted her husband to make inquiries about the so-called doctor. He was told that there was no doctor operating in the area at that time. The man was described as being between the ages of 27-30, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a dark gray overcoat. On the back of this information, police theorized that Maureen had let the killer into her home under the belief that he was some kind of professional like a doctor or a nurse. Perhaps the 27-year-old had fought back when he tried to sexually assault her, and the culprit flew into a rage and attacked her with a knife. Another strange possible suspect in the case was that of the quote, good-looking stranger. This man was described as being rather young and wearing a leather jacket. He was seen several times in the vicinity of the street on the day of the crime. Witnesses saw him running very fast down the road that afternoon, and not long afterwards, he was seen being violently sick outside of the Court Hay Methodist Church. One onlooker noted that the man kept his hands in his pockets the entire time he was vomiting, which they thought was very peculiar. One woman claimed they'd seen the man on the day of the incident. He had knocked on her door and stood before her clapping his hands. Frightened, the woman slammed the door on him and locked it. By January 17th, the police had gathered over 20,000 statements. With the help of witnesses, they put together a composite image of what they thought the man might have looked like. The Liverpool Echo featured the picture on the front of their paper, and within the first 24 hours of it being published, 60 people contacted authorities with information. However, the names that were given to the police were steadily eliminated, and the man in the leather jacket was never identified. The next suspect in the case was a young blonde woman who was seen acting suspiciously when she boarded a bus close to the crime scene. This unidentified woman boarded the number 10D bus on East Prescott Road. She reportedly had an Irish accent and muttered about how she needed to leave the city immediately. Upon exiting the bus, she repeatedly said, "Oh my God, the woman has never been traced and never come forward." The most bizarre theory to ever be explored in Maureen's case was done so by investigators acting under the orders of Deputy Chief Constable of Liverpool, a man named Herbert Balmer. He theorized that the 27-year-old housewife had been executed in an official killing by a Polynesian cult. Several of the cult's followers were believed to be residing in Liverpool, and it was speculated that they may have been making sacrifices to their god, Tiki, during the winter solstice when Maureen was murdered. The followers were reportedly identified by a tattoo of a reverse swastika. While the Deputy Chief Constable at the time considered this theory, its validity remains uncertain. Eventually, the authorities focused on a suspect, a 24-year-old nurse living on Upper Parliament Street. In 1962, he was arrested and charged for stealing medical equipment and drugs from 3 Liverpool hospitals. He was known to have a reverse swastika tattoo and had even posed as a doctor. However, after further investigation, he was ruled out as a suspect in Maureen's murder, and the theory was discarded. Despite regular reviews of the case and appeals for information, the investigation remains open, though it remains unsolved. If the perpetrator is still alive today, they would likely be in their 70s, making it increasingly unlikely that justice will ever be served. Moving on to the next case. Maureen Brubaker Farley. Maureen Brubaker Farley was born and raised in Sioux City, Iowa. In 1971, at the age of 17, she moved to Cedar Rapids to be closer to her husband David, who was incarcerated at Anamosa State Penitentiary. Maureen soon found a job at a local diner. On September 17, 1971, she was last seen purchasing a pack of cigarettes. Later that day, Maureen did not pick up her paycheck from work. By September 20th, when she failed to show up for her shift, her employer reported her as missing. 4 days later, on September 24th, 2 teenage boys found her body in a wooded ravine near a landfill. Her body was positioned on top of the trunk of an abandoned junk car. Initially, the boys mistook her for a woman sleeping, but upon returning to the area later, they noticed the discoloration in her body and realized something was wrong. They immediately went home and notified the police. An autopsy revealed that Maureen died from a skull fracture caused by a blow to the head. Investigators determined that she had been moved after her death, with signs suggesting she had been transported to the crime scene after her life had been taken elsewhere. At the crime scene, investigators were also able to collect DNA evidence belonging to the suspect. 6 months after her body was found, Maureen's mother wrote a letter to the Grand Rapids police saying that George Smith was responsible. George worked at the same diner where Maureen worked. He also worked at a liquor store near her apartment. Police interviewed him, but did not have the evidence to charge him, or anyone else for that matter, so the case went cold. Recently in 2021, the Cedar Rapids Police Department Cold Case Unit took another look at the case. They took the DNA found at the crime scene that belonged to the suspect and created a DNA profile. They then tested it to see if it matched the DNA of George Smith, and it did. The only problem was that Jackass passed away in 2013 at the age of 94. Maureen's younger sister, Lisa, said that she felt a lot of emotions, including relief and closure. She also said that she and her family are satisfied with the evidence. Whenever anybody would pass from this world, my mom said, well, now they're up in heaven with Maureen, and they must be happy. And they know the answers. I just didn't want to wait that long. I didn't want us to wait until we go to the next world. I wanted answers in this world. Police Chief Wayne Germain had this to say in a statement: no matter how much time has passed, our officers are committed to seeking out justice for all victims of violent crime as well as their families. I am extremely proud of the generations of Cedar Rapids officers that contributed to bringing this once cold case to a resolution. Maureen's mother Mary, now 86, revealed why she told the investigators back in 1971 that it was George Smith. He apparently asked investigators constantly about updates in the case. His job at the liquor store involved frequent trips to the landfill as part of a hauling service. Mary also shared her thoughts on the fact that he cannot be prosecuted. She said, "We just figure he'll suffer in hell for it. What's done is done, and at least we know it was him, and we can quit wondering. We can let it go." Moving on to the next case. Lynn Bryant. In 1998, Lynn Bryant, a mother of two, was planning her 41st birthday celebrations when she tragically passed away. Despite receiving significant media coverage at the time, her case has since faded from public memory. Lynn was described by those who knew her as friendly, outgoing, and family-focused, and she was well-liked and known in her community in Rouen High Lanes, South Cornwall. She had two daughters, Erin, 19, and Lee, 21, the latter of whom had recently given birth to Lynn's first grandchild. The 10-month-old baby was the first of what Lynn had hoped would be more grandchildren. She was eagerly looking forward to watching her family grow. On the morning of Tuesday, October 20th, 1998, Lynn went to work, cleaning a nearby house. After finishing her work, she stopped by her parents' house before heading home. Around 12:45 p.m., Lynn drove her gray Ford Sierra to Harris Garage in Tregony but discovered they were out of fuel. She then went to Chenoweth Garage in Rouen High Lanes, where she purchased milk, gas, and some groceries. While there, a scruffy, white van was seen entering the forecourt, driven by an unidentified man with a beard. Authorities later noted that a similar vehicle had been spotted in the days leading up to Lynn's death, though both the vehicle and driver were unfamiliar to the local community. After visiting the garage, Lynn had lunch with her daughter, Erin. The pair chatted about Lynn's upcoming birthday and watched Emmerdale between 1 and 1:30 p.m. Just after 1:30, the 40-year-old took the family dog, a lurcher named Jay, out for a walk. Her family told authorities that Lynn always took the same route. Several witnesses reported seeing her on her way, and told law enforcement later that nothing seemed amiss. A passing motorist saw Lynn talking to a man at the junction by Rouen High Lanes Methodist Chapel. The man is described as being clean-shaven in his 30s, about 5'9", and wearing light-colored clothing. This is the last known sighting of Lynn alive. At 12:30 p.m., Lynn's body was found by a woman driving up the lane between the chapel and Treviel's Manor. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. Panicked, the woman reversed her car back down the road and alerted a local farmer who recognized the body. While emergency services were called, by the time the air ambulance arrived at 2:50 p.m., Lynn was long dead. She had sustained multiple knife wounds to her neck and back, with the fatal blows striking her in the chest. Authorities noted that the 40-year-old had fought her attacker viciously, and that her clothing was disturbed, which led them to believe she had been the victim of a sexually motivated assault. Law enforcement determined that the murder weapon was a single-edged blade between 10–14 centimeters long. It was likely either a penknife or a small kitchen knife, but so far it has never been located. Despite the fact that police immediately carried out a fingertip search of the area after Lynn's body was found. One interesting clue found at the scene was the vivid blue polyester cotton mixed fibers that were located on Lynn's body. The fibers have never been matched to a specific garment, but are commonly used in both polo shirts and sweatshirts. They are alien to Lynn and her home, leading investigators to conclude that they must have come from the perpetrator. Authorities also stated that due to the struggle and the mud splatter found on the 40-year-old's clothing, they believe the culprit would have mud and blood on their clothing. Another local farmer told the police that he'd seen a man walking across his field between 2:45 and 3 p.m. This was unusual to him because there was no footpath across the area, and it was never used by walkers. He noted that the man wasn't dressed for a walk or a hike, either wearing regular everyday clothing instead. Another bizarre incident that occurred in Lynn's case was that of her tortoise-shell glasses, which she had been wearing when she left the house earlier, but were not found on or with her body. They also did not turn up when the police searched the area. 4 months later, however, on February 2, 1999, the glasses were located sitting on top of the murder at the gateway where the mother of two's body was found. Authorities have been unable to determine where they came from, suspecting that either a member of the public found them or that the perpetrator of the crime had taken them as a trophy, and for some reason, returned them afterwards. The investigation into Lynn's horrific murder was long. 3,144 house-to-house inquiry forms were completed. 1,600 alibis were established. 7,884 statements were taken, and 6,573 vehicles were traced and eliminated. All men between the ages of 14 and 70 who were living in a 1-mile radius of the crime scene were traced, and their alibis checked and cooperated. Due to the remote location of the crime scene, authorities concluded that the culprit was either a local to the area or knew it well. Perhaps they worked nearby or had family who lived in the community. In 2015, investigators who were reviewing the case managed to pull a partial DNA profile from the evidence. Although DNA samples had been taken in 1998, authorities had to begin the process all over again with some 6,000 people in 2016. This was because new legislation which had come into effect 3 years earlier had compelled law enforcement to destroy the old samples. So far, however, these efforts have not led to an arrest or a conviction, although 3 suspects were cleared using the DNA profile. In 2018, on 20th anniversary of Lynn's death, authorities put out a fresh appeal for information which led them to receive 160 calls. 27 new leads involving 13 people came as a result. That same year, a reconstruction of the 40-year-old's last known movement was made and released to the public. The 3 men police wished to speak to have never come forward or been identified. These men include the man seen driving the white car-derived van, the man who spoke with Lynn at the chapel, and the man who was witnessed walking across the field. It's unknown if any of them have anything to do with the crime. In 2016, a former intelligence officer named Chris Clark put forward the theory that Lynn's case is linked with that of Helen Fleet and Kate Bushell. Both women were tragically murdered while out walking their dogs. Kate Bushell, only 14 years old, was discovered dead in Exwick, Exeter, on November 15, 1990. She had been walking a neighbor's dog when she was found with a knife wound to her neck. Helen Fleet, age 66, was beaten to death while walking her dogs on March 28, 1987, in Walbury Woods, Weston-super-Mare. Neither of these cases has been solved, and law enforcement has never officially connected these murders with each other. Lynn Bryant's case also remains unsolved. In December 1998, 300 mourners attended her funeral at Penmount Crematorium in Truro. Crime Stoppers is offering a £10,000 reward for any information that could lead to an arrest. If you have any information about Lynn's or Maureen's cases, you can contact Crime Stoppers anonymously at 0800555111. Moving on to the next case. Siberian Kamerdaiban Mountain Range Tragedy. In August 1993, during the height of summer, 6 spirited and adventurous friends, all passionate about the outdoors and backpacking, set off on a journey most nature enthusiasts could only dream of. However, what began as a relatively simple trek quickly turned tragic when sudden and inexplicable symptoms claimed the lives of 6 out of the 7 hikers. Throughout the 1990s, and even today, though to a lesser extent, groups of tourists from Russia and Ukraine frequently traveled to the Siberian Kamerdaiban mountain range to explore its vast coniferous forests, rich with cedar trees and pristine freshwater lakes. This mountain range encircles the Pearl of Siberia, a lake that contains approximately 20% of the world's fresh surface water, more than the combined volume of all the North American Great Lakes. Even now, thousands of visitors journey to these mountains each year to witness the breathtaking beauty of Siberia's wilderness. The 6 highly capable hikers, all between the ages of 15 and 24, hailed from Petropavlovsk, Russia, and had spent years honing their outdoor survival skills. Despite their youth, all 6 had extensive experience with long-distance hikes and survival expeditions of varying difficulty. Their chosen trek took them through the rugged Kamerdaiban Mountains, one of the earliest documented mountain ranges in history, and the world's oldest mapped landmass. Since the range borders Lake Baikal to the south, it boasts stunning landscapes and is uniquely accessible by air travel, allowing more people to explore its rolling hills and towering peaks. However, for this unfortunate group, the adventure would take a horrifying turn as they encountered an unknown and deadly force, one that would ultimately leave only a single survivor. Leading this enthusiastic team of 6 was the highly skilled and respected guide, Lyudmila Ivanovna Korovina. Korovina was remembered as a strikingly beautiful, strong-willed, and athletic woman, a 41-year-old expert survivalist and the head of Azimut, Petropavlovsk's renowned tourist club, which was part of a larger outdoor education program. Her reputation as a world-class leader and wilderness instructor made her highly sought after, with adventurers traveling great distances for the chance to hike under her guidance. Having trained extensively for years, she was occasionally criticized for her strict survivalist approach, yet former students were willing to travel across the country to learn from her. One of her former hiking team members once remarked, "She knew how to unite people, to create a team. She believed in others. She had a way of bringing out a person's true potential. Under her mentorship, each of us was able to push our limits and grow in every aspect of life." The hikers under Korovina's leadership ranged in age from 15 to 24. The oldest among them was 24-year-old Tatiana Filipenko. Another key member was 23-year-old Alexander Sasha Kresin, who was more than just a student. Many considered him an adopted son to Korovina. The 23-year-old, affectionately called Sasha, a common Russian nickname for Alexander, had been mentored by Korovina for years. More than just a student of her survival techniques, he was a trusted family friend. The rest of the group included 19-year-old Denis Vashin, 17-year-old Valentina Valia Yudichenko, and 16-year-old Victoria Vika Zalasova, the least experienced among them. Vika had participated in previous hiking trips, but not as extensively as the others. She had joined the expedition as a friend of another member, and while Korovina initially hesitated to include her, acknowledging that even Vika's own friends admitted she could be quite vocal in her complaints, she was ultimately invited along. The youngest of the group was 15-year-old Tamir Babanov, who, despite his age, was remarkably skilled in outdoor survival. By the end of the journey, only one of the 7 would survive to recount the terrifying ordeal. Victoria, Denis, Alexander, Tamir, Tatiana, Valentina, and their seasoned leader, Korovina, set out around August 1st, though some reports suggest it may have been August 2nd. Their trek began in the village of Moreno, leading them through the Langutai Gate Gorge. As they progressed, they eventually reached the highest point of their route, ascending Kanilu, the tallest peak in the Kamardaban range. From there, they began the descent, unaware that their journey was about to take a deadly turn. After crossing the Antigua and Baixa rivers, the group continued their journey toward the Watershed Plateau, reaching this area around August 4th. By this time, they had been trekking for several days, covering an estimated 70 kilometers, roughly 44 miles, through rugged terrain. Their route was classified as a level 3 trek on a scale of 1 to 5, making it challenging but not among the most extreme difficulty levels. Despite the demands of the journey, the hikers took time to forage, gather, and dry golden root, a medicinal plant known for its restorative properties. They eventually reached a summit situated between 2 towering peaks, Faliatsuginli, which rises to approximately 2,204 meters, and Tiliotranas, standing at about 2,310 meters. At this altitude, the group was nearly 7,545 feet above sea level. However, their chosen campsite raised some questions. They set up camp on a windswept plateau, an exposed and barren ridge offering no natural shelter from the increasingly strong gusts. Those familiar with the region describe this area as almost otherworldly, with a landscape resembling that of Mars. The sloped terrain offered little more than rocks, dry grass, and howling winds, leaving many to question why the group chose this exposed location for their campsite instead of a much safer grove of trees just 4 kilometers, about 2.5 miles, away. This alternative site, situated in a lower forest zone, would have required descending approximately 400 meters, over 1,300 feet, but it would have provided far better protection from the worsening weather. Local rescuers also pointed out another viable option. The hikers could have climbed to the top of the nearest mountain, where an emergency shelter had been constructed specifically for tourists. There, they would have found dry firewood and a designated place to rest, offering them much-needed refuge from the brutal storm that was rapidly closing in. Reaching this emergency shelter would have taken only 30 minutes, yet for reasons unknown to investigators, Korovina did not lead her group there. This decision puzzled many, sparking debate among hindsight critics who questioned why she had not chosen the tree-covered grove instead. Those familiar with Korovina's teaching methods speculated that she may have intentionally picked the exposed ridge as a training exercise, aiming to challenge her team's survival skills in harsh conditions. However, another, more somber theory emerged. Some wondered if the group stopped in this barren, unprotected landscape because any detour, either toward the forest or the shelter, would have taken them off their planned route. Korovina had arranged to meet another hiking group, and deviating from the designated path might have delayed their scheduled rendezvous. Korovina had been managing 2 hiking groups simultaneously, a fairly common practice for extended backpacking expeditions in the region. This particular trek was designed as part of a larger multi-group journey, with the hikers scheduled to rendezvous at predetermined locations along the route. In a tragic twist of fate, the leader of the second group was none other than Korovina's own daughter. Although neither leader carried walkie-talkies, they had arranged to meet at approximately 4 designated points along the trail, believing these intersections would be sufficient to maintain communication in case of any issues. Both mother and daughter were seasoned survivalists, and their plan was to eventually merge their groups and complete the final stretch of the journey together, an unforgettable mother-daughter adventure in the making. However, instead of reuniting with her mother as planned, Korovina's daughter, assuming the worsening weather had disrupted their schedule, continued onward with her own group. After completing the trek, the 16-year-old flew back to her hometown in Kazakhstan, entirely unaware that her mother had died in the very same vicinity, and at the very same time she was hiking. Unlike a steep mountain peak, the area the hikers were traversing was more of a rounded dome, and given that it was summertime, the weather had been forecasted to remain mild. Korovina had carefully studied meteorological reports before the trip, ensuring the group was well prepared for expected conditions. However, on their third day, they were unexpectedly met with freezing rain and light snowfall. What they could not have known was that, on August 3rd, a Mongolian cyclone had swept into the Irkutsk region, an unforeseen weather event that directly contradicted the projections Korovina had relied upon. The formation of the shockingly strong surface winds caused by the passage of the cyclonic cold front took the hikers by surprise, and by nightfall the wind had become terroristic and oppressive in its unyielding nature. Their trek took them on the border of two climate zones, the West Siberian Plains and Mongolia to the south of Lake Baikal, and in both zones, the weather phenomenon of cyclogenesis can be created. This summertime event was unexpected based on forecasts, but not rare for the region. Because of the lack of internet technology at the time, the exact temperatures for that day are unknown. While publicly accessible weather histories of the Irkutsk region only go back as far as 1999, a look at the average temperatures historically show no instances of extreme cold in the month of August. Data for the Irkutsk region state that the average low is only 11 degrees Celsius, and the average high is around 21 degrees Celsius. This means that historically the region did not get below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. However warm the temperature was forecasted to be, the group was prepared for rain in general as the region averaged 15 days of rain in the month of August, with Siberia experiencing the most rain in the summer months. So, while the cyclone was unexpected in its ferocity, the group was prepared to encounter rain overall and did indeed have the proper supplies and clothing. At 4 in the morning on August 5th, the seams of the hikers' tents, already tight from being blown in the wind and close to breaking, burst, and while the experienced group fixed what material they could, the wind and dew persisted through the damaged tents, and at 6 a.m., they awoke again to wet sleeping bags and decided to begin their day, as sleep was not going to come with their dampness. At around 11 a.m. on August 5th, a wet and weather-beaten group broke down the already very broken-down campsite and started walking again. Prior to the time that the group was able to pack up and leave, Sasha, the 24-year-old, walked up to one of the tents and complained, presumably to Korovina, of feeling ill. Despite feeling unwell, his symptoms not specified, Sasha decided to press on with the group in hopes of traversing more ground and completing yet another hike. Unfortunately, within the first few kilometers of the group's hike, Sasha started to stumble and fall. Sasha fell multiple times until he became so weak that everyone else in the group had to take on his pack load and help him along. Sasha, the oldest male of the group at age 24 and Korovina's so-called adopted son, then began bleeding from the ears and started foaming at the mouth. Alarmed, Korovina decided to stay back with Sasha and administer aid. She encouraged the remaining two men, one only 15 and the other 19 years old, to lead the rest of the group to the tree line below in order to dry off and hopefully get their firewood to a state that it was able to be burned. However, halfway to the forest's edge, the group turned back. Why specifically is unknown, but it can be assumed that something felt very wrong and the young adults wanted to be close to their leader. One of the group members, Tatiana, brought Korovina a tent in hopes of erecting a temporary shelter from the now roaring storm that had descended upon the valley. When the group looked to Sasha for his condition, they saw his eyes were wide and dark and his pupils dilated. When Tatiana tried to get the now unresponsive Sasha moved under a tent to partially protect him from the oppressive wind, Val tried to help her, but Korovina told them both to stop what they were doing and go straight to the trees and seek shelter. Upon hearing this, Val, 17, grabbed her friend Victoria, 16, to bring her along to the shelter of the forest, but Victoria proceeded to bite Val's hand in response. Shocked but not deterred, Val had to drag the now incomprehensible teen by her hair to the resting point, with Victoria fighting and kicking back most of the way. Val, not yet to the trees because of the now hostile Victoria, turned back around to seek out Korovina, this time to complain that Victoria was not being cooperative in getting to the trees. When Val returned to the group members, she came upon a startling scene. Tatiana was bent double, intentionally banging her own head against the rocks over and over again. Val then looked to Tamir, the 15-year-old, who was grasping at his throat like he couldn't breathe. He soon collapsed. Dennis, the 19-year-old, screamed at Val to grab sleeping supplies and get to the shelter quickly, but when she looked back to reply, she watched him drop the sleeping bag he had just retrieved and fall to the ground, violently writhing and ripping at the clasps of his clothes, just as the other 5 had done. When Val tried to help him, he too fought her off, kicking, adamant in his refusal for her assistance. Bleeding profusely from the ears and foaming at the mouth, 6 of the 7 members of the group had now descended into what could only be described as madness, witnessed only by one unscathed and uncertain 17-year-old. Some of the group members were hiding behind rocks. One had slunk into their sleeping bag panic-stricken, others ran around aimlessly. Val stood helpless as the whole group writhed on the floor, banging their heads against the rocks and the ground and ripping and tearing at their clothes. Some of the members, now in partial states of undress, gradually stopped moving while others continued to shake and move about. Knowing she was incapable of helping more than she already had, Val grabbed enough supplies to temporarily survive the storm and headed to the tree line. There she made enough of an awning underneath the cover of a stone to keep the wind at bay, and eventually she fell into a not-so-restful sleep. The next morning after the storm had passed, Val went back to investigate her group mate's condition. She found that at least 5 of the 6 group members had passed away in the night. She later recalls that upon returning to their bodies, she did not expect anyone to be alive because the symptoms exhibited that night prior seemed fatal, but that she needed both closure and supplies. While some reports say that Val closed each of her fellow friends' eyes, what she actually said became lost in translation in the media, and what she purportedly said according to a local Russian translator was not that she closed their eyes but that she closed or averted her own eyes from the dead. Some sources say that at this point, the morning after the mass psychosis exhibited by the group, that group leader Korovina was still alive and able to feebly give Val directions on how to escape the mountains, but this is not repeated in other sources, so that detail is still in debate. What is known is that the 17-year-old then took a compass, food rations and other survival tools from the back of the deceased group leader and set out to find the Anikta River, a known landmark to the young woman who was now traversing alone. The nearby river was too rough to cross, so Val camped out for the night near an electric tower. When the sun rose the next morning, she saw that there were wires running from the electric tower. Val attempted to find safety in civilization by visually tracing and following the electric cables and wires which brought service to some of the most remote parts of Siberia, but unfortunately the cables just ended at a remote and abandoned town devoid of occupants, food or phone service. Let down by the false promise of hope from the presence of electric wires in a town long abandoned, Val then attempted to follow the water pipes which flowed from the empty village. That led her to a nearby river, where she then became so exhausted from her 3-day trek that she stopped to rest, hanging her white t-shirt on the limbs of a tree to dry out. Knowing that she had little food and light warmth for survival, the haggard and weary teenager later recalled that at that point she was preparing herself for death. As luck would have it, tourists from Kiev, Ukraine who were out rafting saw Val on the riverbanks. Initially, they were not alarmed as the 17-year-old made no attempt whatsoever to call out to them and didn't show outward signs of distress. Eventually, the tourists' consciousness got the better of them and they turned around to check on the lone teenager and make sure that she was safe. At this point, logic had come back to Val and she was waving at them furiously. Upon their approach, she rushed at them crying that people were dead and she was scared. She was taken by the concerned tourists to a local hospital and authorities were contacted. After her initial outcry, she clammed up and became almost catatonic once safe in the hospital. This type of reaction is common for someone who has just exerted a high amount of adrenaline for an extended period of time. At the hospital, Val was at first reticent to share her story with the investigators, but eventually some of the details came out, however murky. These details given by Val and the recollections of her rescue and outcry to the tourists were the only ones that the media had access to and some of the only immediate accounts of the incident. For this reason, some details may have been slightly altered or possibly lost in translation. The bodies of the 6 group members had to remain alone for weeks, visited only by scavengers, until August 26th, although some reports say it was 21st, because the mountains were far too windy and dangerous to find and recover the bodies safely. Members of the search and rescue party sent to the scene of the incident by helicopter recall that the bodies were paired off in smaller groups scattered across 40 to 50 meters of ground. The 6 hikers, previously young, strong, virulent, and full of life, were now reduced to bloated and swollen corpses, with death-imprinted grimaces on their faces and in partial states of undress of their many layers, with some only wearing their thin, full-bodied undergarments. 3 of the stricken were without shoes, a fact which lined up with Val's recollection of the hikers desperately ripping off their garments. Workers recall that Korovina was lying on top of Sasha, possibly in one last act of protection. Rescue workers noted that scavengers had consumed the hikers' eyes and tongues, as soft tissues are typically the first to be targeted post-mortem. The deteriorated state of the bodies left few physical clues for forensic examination, and the powerful windstorm that had swept through the area likely erased any non-biological evidence from the scene. The official autopsy reports, conducted in Ulanyud, East Siberia, concluded that all 6 hikers had died from hypothermia. However, this explanation did not sit well with friends and family, who couldn't ignore the glaring inconsistencies in the case. Given the region's typical summer temperature fluctuations, with nighttime lows averaging around 50 degrees Fahrenheit 10 degrees Celsius, the idea that the entire group had simply frozen to death seemed implausible. The most unsettling detail was that a lone survivor, a 17-year-old, neither the largest nor the strongest of the group, managed to endure for 3 more days without any apparent ill effects or cognitive impairment. To those left behind, this scenario seemed highly improbable, leaving them with more questions than answers. Supporters of the hypothermia theory pointed out that the group had been exposed to continuous rain for over 24 hours by the time symptoms began appearing. When combined with wind chill, these conditions could have resulted in extreme cold. Additionally, hypothermia can trigger paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where individuals, in a delusional state, feel overwhelmingly hot despite actually freezing to death. Some believe that the hikers tearing off their clothing supported this explanation. However, beyond this singular detail, the hypothermia theory failed to align with the disturbing symptoms witnessed by Val, the lone survivor. The horrific scenes she described, including foaming at the mouth, profuse bleeding from the ears, and individuals violently smashing their heads against rocks, bore little resemblance to the typical physiological responses associated with hypothermia. Nowhere in any documented cases of hypothermic patients were such antics observed. Quite to the contrary, in fact, people freezing to death often become slower and more lethargic over time, and eventually stop to take their final rest and pass without violent or even visible symptoms. Additionally, while the weather was inclement and stormy, it was still August, summertime. It was not the dead of winter or even in the winter months. Additionally, experts claim that hypothermia being the cause of death does not make sense because that area was not a desert where temperatures can fluctuate rapidly and, as it was August in a forest, the elements, however unyielding, could not have caused such an instantaneous cold with such fatal results. Theories are varied, but with the limited press coverage of this particular incident, and the lack of information from Val, theories are all the families of survivors have to hold on to in hopes of receiving some sort of explanation or closure. Later, in what some would say is victim blaming but others say is just common sense, it is said that in Korovina's insistence that they stay on schedule so as to meet up with her daughter and their hiking group on time and to not miss the allotted intersection window, that she made a rash decision which snowballed into a series of fatal mistakes, which led to the death of her charges. Critics say that her unwillingness to traverse a couple miles out of the way in order to seek shelter in the trees could be reasoned as a major contributing factor to the exposure death. But none of this explains why the group members were foaming at the mouth or bleeding from the ears, as that is not a known symptom of exposure. One theory is that the KGB, the Russian Committee for State Security, was testing some new type of weapon, possibly sound or nuclear-based. Some wonder if this could have been a type of weapon which could incapacitate and cause fatalities from some distance away. There is also speculation that a nerve agent of some sort could have been either knowingly or unknowingly unleashed on the unsuspecting campers, as bleeding from the ears is a common symptom of nerve agents. This theory is fueled by the strangeness of the lack of details and the inconsistencies in official reports and media coverage. This conspiracy speculates that Val, as the only witness to the hypothetical government activities, was paid off, and that is the reasoning behind her decision to move far away and her reluctance to discuss the matter. This type of hypothetical weapon, however, doesn't explain why Val was unharmed in the supposed testing, and this theory is more based on conspiracy rather than any concrete evidence. Some postulate that the group's symptoms could align with the consumption of poison mushrooms or some other food-based toxin. Others wonder if their water was contaminated. Some asked if the stew that they consumed as their last meal contained toxins in some form, but doctors interviewed stressed that due to different body metabolism and different enzymatic reactions, that kind of food-based sickness or poisoning would affect each in a slightly different way and at different times, not so synchronously as Val recalls it. No evidence of a food-based illness existed in the autopsy report, and Val recalls that she and the group members shared all food. In response to the fact that they all shared the same food, those researching the case wonder if Val was protected somehow, perhaps by a secret Korovina was hiding in her rucksack. Some wonder if the sole survivor, Val, may have been the only one to eat the so-called golden root plant that Korovina had been surreptitiously collecting along their trip, an act that possibly protected Val from whatever harm befell the group, be it from a natural or man-made source. Golden root, its scientific name Rhodila rosea, is a perennial that grows in the wild in the mountains of Siberia. The raw roots are said to be limitless in their potential for medicinal use. In the early 50s, Russian scientists classified golden root as a quote adaptogen because it has the potential to create a bodily resistance to certain toxins and supports one's adaptation to various stressors that might befall the taker. The golden root also contains a chemical called sildenafil. Sildenafil is the active ingredient in the ED drug Viagra. For this reason, the root has a high resale value, especially in remote areas without access to prescription drugs. Golden root has an incredibly slow pattern of growth and only has the potential to help people medicinally when fully matured after nearly 12 years of growth. This long growing period and the root's presence in limited regions makes fully grown golden roots highly valuable and sought after. Rescue workers found a bag of these roots, and some say that this amount shows that Korovina took more than needed, ostensibly to sell for profit. While some theorize that the consumption of this root was beneficial to Val and that it possibly saved her life, others wonder if the plant was actually the root of all their problems. Those indigenous to the area believe that the golden root has mystical properties, and Siberian folklore states that those who take more than they need for just personal consumption will be spiritually punished. Due to a lack of access to official statements, it is unknown whether Val actually consumed the roots and if they aided her somehow. Was there another death on the mountain? Did another person die on the mountain with the same symptoms of foaming at the mouth and bleeding from the ears? Some sources report that another fatality may have occurred on the same mountain, but no more information is given, and coverage is not only suspiciously light on the actual group's incident but also in Russian and therefore translated through Google Translate by those who wish to research the incident decades later. Friends of Korovina admit that while Korovina could be extreme in her approach to survivalism, employing tactics that would help the group if they ever encountered an emergency situation, those close to her say that Korovina never took outdoor education to the extreme that her charges would be in danger. A Russian media source initially claimed that the group was food insecure, claiming that the presence of a single soup can and a small tin of meat left at the campsite shows that the group was running on empty, though most unlikely. The medical examiner considered it because of the absence of insulin in post-mortem blood samples of the victims. The only other medical reason that could explain this lack of glucose in the blood of the deceased, however, would be similar to a diabetic-like type of insulin resistance, but how that could have affected an entire group is unknown. The first issue with the theory that the group was experiencing the effects of malnutrition is that the media source was basing their assumptions on the presence, or lack thereof, of food waste at the campsite. But those in the backpacking community understand that the best and most respectful hikers always pack out their trash so as to avoid contaminating the area. And because the scene of the incident was not sealed nor protected from the elements for many weeks, it's possible that scavengers and the weather took what remained of the group's food rations and waste. Moreover, It's only logical to think that even if the group was malnourished, they would have slowly wasted away and would not have gone wild banging their heads against the rocks and bleeding from the ears. No publications on those types of symptoms occurring in the actions of those who have starved to death exist, as mania and orifice bleeding are not symptoms of starvation. For this reason, the theory of malnutrition is not one taken seriously and mostly originated in the original Russian media write-ups that relied heavily on second-hand information of the search group, and not from Val herself. This reliance on second-hand information caused the media to make sweeping assumptions without ever knowing the history of Korovina or her skill sets and methodology. A friend recalls that Korovina was a stickler for survivalist learning, but she was also someone who would have insisted the hikers be nourished before pressing on, and would not have allowed the young hikers to become so malnourished that they encountered death. Many speak of the professionalism of Korovina as she was all about triple-checking the supplies. Val, the survivor of the group, says that they planned to have enough food to consume 2,400 calories a day, and that food was not a factor in their untimely demise. The tallest part of the mountain the group climbed that day reached a peak of 2,396 meters, and when the group stopped to rest they were at 23,100 meters, which is about 7,545 feet above sea level, a high altitude but not one so high that it would cause such extreme illness. For comparison purposes, the lodge at Heavenly in South Lake Tahoe, a common respite for people of all health and ability levels as well as by families with children, has a base altitude of around 2,000 meters 6,000 feet and peaks just above 3,068 meters or around 10,000 feet. This resort and its slopes are enjoyed by those who have driven from San Francisco, a sea-level city, the same day. And while altitude sickness can happen at the resort's highest peaks, it is never as extreme as what the group experienced. Moreover, in the South Lake Tahoe Lodge, at the base level of the resort where the hotel is located, which is an almost exact altitude to what the stricken hikers were experiencing, altitude sickness is almost unheard of, and when it manifests itself, it's usually in the form of a headache or light nausea, remedied often by only water. High-altitude pulmonary edema can cause bleeding from the eyes, but bleeding from the ears is not mentioned in the symptoms. Moreover, high-altitude pulmonary edema or cerebral edema often causes symptoms closer to drunkenness rather than rage, violence, or panic. While the hikers' hometown of Petropavlovsk is only 150 meters, roughly 500 feet, above sea level, the hikers had almost a week to acclimate to the increased altitude, so the claims that they could have been sickened with extreme altitude poisoning is doubted by many. Additionally, altitude sickness affects everybody differently depending on many factors, so the fact that all of the group members went mad and were sickened at relatively the same time is not conducive to altitude sickness. Many believe the lack of correlation with the known symptoms of altitude sickness, and the data of the hikers' trek upwards show that a force other than the altitude was responsible for the death of 6 previously joyous adventurers. What many believe to be the most logical and explanatory theory, while still not completely perfect in its explanation, lies in the hidden and largely untapped power of sound as a weapon. Some wonder if the Mongolian cyclone which overtook the area was actually an anticyclone. Well, a cyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a center of low atmospheric pressure. An anticyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a high atmospheric pressure with varied results. Some theorize that this particular anticyclone caused such an intense wind that magnetic vibrations began to descend upon the hikers, and when combined with the strong air currents, it set in motion a strange and largely obscure phenomenon called infrasound. While sound has been publicly investigated as a weapon of war from as early as 1957, but most likely far before that in sealed military research, this particular instance of infrasound is hypothesized to have been created by the wind, and that the wind created such a low noise that it became unsettling and possibly fatal. According to one article, the large boulders present on the ridge that the hikers stopped to rest on when hit with unusually strong winds at a certain angle can become a quote infrasonic generator of enormous power, which causes a person to experience a state of panic and unaccountable horror. Because airborne sound of sufficient intensity enters the body by direct absorption and in turn stimulates the non-auditory tissue, infrasound can produce physiological effects, essentially similar to a whole-body seizure. This low-frequency noise can be perceived by the brain, but not by the ears on a conscious level. When exposed to these types of sounds, the human body has the potential to react to a noise of which it does not realize it is hearing. Such sensations can trigger overwhelming terror and panic, similar to what Val described witnessing. Experts studying infrasound for military applications suggest that high-intensity acoustic energy can lead to a wide range of effects. It may cause temporary or permanent hearing damage, increased heart rate and blood pressure, as well as physical distress such as pain, vertigo, nausea, and vomiting. Researchers examining infrasound as a potential weapon have identified 7 Hz as the most dangerous frequency for the brain, as it aligns with the median alpha rhythm of human brain activity. This is particularly concerning because 7 Hz is also the resonant frequency of several internal organs, meaning exposure to such sound waves can directly impact the central nervous system. Existing literature on the subject suggests that prolonged exposure to low-frequency acoustic energy can result in severe disorientation, often accompanied by panic and heightened anxiety. Beyond these psychological effects, additional physiological symptoms, including bowel spasms, vomiting, collapsed lungs, and in extreme cases, organ rupture and death, have been documented at frequencies below 7 Hz. Reports indicate that the 6 victims exhibited signs of restlessness, confused speech, anxiety, and disorientation, as noted by Wall. However, one striking inconsistency with the infrasound theory is the presence of ear bleeding among the victims. Moreover, the effects of infrasound at high altitudes remain largely unexplored due to ethical concerns surrounding animal testing and the absence of willing human subjects for experimentation. As a result, gaps in scientific understanding persist, leaving room for the possibility that infrasound may have caused additional, yet unknown, symptoms. Since each human brain and nervous system responds uniquely to external stimuli, not everyone experiences the effects of infrasound in the same manner. This variability could explain why Val remained unaffected while the others succumbed to mysterious symptoms. Factors such as her age, gender, and individual physiological traits may have shielded her from whatever force triggered the others' distress. Because sound waves influence people differently, it is possible that Sasha was the first to fall ill due to heightened sensitivity, perhaps as a result of his age and gender. As the oldest male in the group, he may have been more vulnerable to the frequency, setting off a chain reaction that ultimately led to the group's demise. With no definitive answers, speculation is all that remains of this tragedy. The case is officially closed, with authorities maintaining that hypothermia was the cause of death. However, for the friends and families of the 6 lost hikers, unsettling questions persist. Even after all these years, Val steadfastly refuses to discuss the horrifying events. When approached by reporters for an interview, she once responded sharply, "Do you think I want to relive this nightmare? I had to leave, change my entire life. I don't want to remember it." Moving on to the next case. Elizabeth Barazza. Elizabeth Barazza, beloved for her compassion and creativity, lived her life with a strong commitment to making the world a better place. Her passion for charity work and her unwavering dedication to spreading joy were evident in everything she did. Liz had an unmatched ability to connect with others, lifting their spirits with her generosity and selflessness. Tragically, her life was cut short by a senseless, unsolved murder in the early hours of January 25, 2019, leaving those who knew her, from northwest Harris County to across the state of Texas, searching for answers. Despite the wealth of evidence surrounding the case, no clear answers have emerged, leaving everyone involved in a state of confusion and uncertainty. This is an attempt to make sense of the tragedy and offer a more thorough analysis of the circumstances leading to Liz's death. She embodied the best of humanity, people who bring peace to others, make sacrifices for the greater good, and encourage happiness wherever they go. Liz's actions were a reflection of the belief that a brighter future for all begins with kindness, authenticity, and a commitment to helping others. In her absence, the community and those who knew her continued to search for justice, hoping to bring closure to a life lost too soon. Elizabeth Barazza was truly a remarkable person, whose influence and kindness left a lasting impact on everyone she encountered. A child of the 1990s and a native of Southeast Texas, Liz was deeply immersed in the worlds of fantasy, storytelling, and pop culture from a young age. Her love for science fiction was fostered by her father, Robert Jr., and she developed a particular affection for Star Wars. Liz grew up watching the films, and as she got older, she dove into the expansive Star Wars universe through television series, comic books, and novels. When new releases weren't available, Liz would turn to her other favorite escapist worlds, especially Harry Potter. A self-proclaimed Potterhead, Liz became an expert in all things wizardry and magic, eagerly awaiting each new book release. Her passion for these imaginative realms didn't stop at enjoying them. Liz also became skilled in arts and crafts, particularly in costume making. She had an incredible talent for creating intricate, detailed outfits inspired by her favorite characters. As she grew older, Liz realized that she wasn't alone in this passion. There was an entire community of like-minded costume enthusiasts, known as cosplayers, who came together to celebrate their love for pop culture at conventions across the country. For Liz, these conventions were a place to connect with others who shared her enthusiasm and creativity, and she proudly showcased her amazing creations. Liz's passion for cosplay and Star Wars led her to a deep connection with Sergio Barazza, a fellow Texas native who shared her love for the escapist hobby. The couple, united by their shared interests, married in the winter of 2014, blending their enthusiasm for Star Wars and cosplaying. Together, they traveled to comic conventions across Texas and the broader United States, showcasing Liz's expert crafting skills and passion for bringing characters to life. Outside of conventions, Liz and Sergio were active members of the 501st Legion, a renowned organization of Star Wars fans who create and wear screen-accurate replicas of the franchise's most iconic villains. The 501st Legion isn't just about costumes. It's a community of over 14,000 volunteers who use their creations to support charitable causes. Members visit hospitals, attend fundraising events, and raise awareness for medical research and other important causes. For Liz, these charitable endeavors were at the heart of her life's mission. She didn't hesitate to donate her time and energy to brighten the lives of those who needed it most, particularly sick children and adults, showing a level of selflessness and compassion that defined her character. Liz and Sergio Barazza had always been a devoted couple, bound by shared passions and an unwavering work ethic. Their bond only grew stronger over the 5 years they spent together, marked by both personal and professional accomplishments. Liz's selfless nature, exemplified by her dedication to the 501st Legion and charitable work, complemented Sergio's own commitment to their shared passions. In celebration of their upcoming 5th anniversary, Liz planned a magical trip to Orlando, Florida, with a visit to the newly opened Harry Potter attractions at Universal Studios. The excitement of the trip was heightened by Liz's anticipation of wearing the homemade costumes she had crafted for the occasion. To make the vacation more financially feasible, Liz and Sergio decided to hold a garage sale, selling old items from around their house. What began as a simple, innocent effort to ease their finances soon spiraled into a tragic event. As they prepared for their anniversary celebration, the couple's routine was shattered by the shocking and unsolved murder of Liz Barazza. The timeline of events leading to Liz's untimely death begins just after New Year's Day 2019, as Liz and Sergio were filled with hope and excitement for the future, blissfully unaware that tragedy was on the horizon. The couple plans the perfect celebration, choosing the new Harry Potter attractions at Universal Studios Florida as their dream destination. They set their departure for the end of the month and begin making arrangements. As January goes on, Liz and Sergio realize that their anniversary trip will stretch their budget to the limit. Liz also wants to buy Sergio a few gifts, so the couple decides to hold a garage sale just before their departure, selling items they no longer need to raise some extra spending money for the trip. As the month draws to a close, they finalize the details of the sale. They plan it just days before their Florida trip and inform close friends, family, and coworkers, keeping the news private from social media and the wider town. The last week of January arrives, and Liz requests time off work for both the trip and the sale. Working as a data reporter for a pipeline inspection company, Liz manages to get the time off approved. On the night of January 24th, Liz and Sergio make their final preparations. Sergio prepares to go to work as usual, while Liz tells him she'll wake up early with him to start putting up signs for their garage sale before sunrise. The couple falls asleep, eager for the day ahead, unaware of the danger that awaits. As the rooster crows on Friday, January 25, 2019, the morning is just breaking. Sergio gets ready for work while Liz gathers the supplies for the signs. She steps outside with him as he climbs into his truck. At the same time, security and CCTV cameras capture a 2013 or newer dark-colored Nissan Frontier Pro 4X driving through the Barazza Tombol suburb, a vehicle unfamiliar to the neighbors and never seen in the area at such an early hour. At around 6:48 a.m., Sergio kisses Liz goodbye and drives off in his truck, with CCTV footage showing him leaving the housing complex on his way to work. Over the next 4 minutes, Liz begins setting up the signs alone in her front yard, unaware of any visitor or unusual event. At around 6:52 a.m., the same Nissan Frontier is spotted again on a neighbor's doorbell camera, now facing Liz's front yard where she continues working outside. The dark-colored truck passes the house and parks in another home's driveway. From the driver's seat, a person with either long hair or a wig exits the vehicle and walks towards the spots where Liz places a sign. The pursuant, wearing what could either be a trench coat or a long robe, conceals something as they walk up to Liz. Liz looks up startled, but doesn't run away. Only 8 seconds pass of what appears to be a quiet conversation before the figure in the long garments pulls out a gun and shoots Liz 3 times at point-blank range. The killer then steps over Liz's body, seemingly checking for something before firing off one final point-blank shot. As the clock ticks forward to 6:53 a.m., the shooter sprints from Liz's body back to their truck. They hop inside back out of the driveway and drive up and down the street once more, almost as if observing the crime scene before peeling out from the neighborhood away from the cameras and forever into anonymity. At the same time, a male subject who heard the gunfire and saw the truck escape runs outside and calls 911 to report both the shooting and ask for an emergency medical response. Meanwhile, another neighbor who comes outside in response to the commotion quickly understands what has happened and personally calls Sergio to inform him Liz has been shot. Not even 10 minutes go by, and Sergio returns to the neighborhood to tend to his critically injured wife. Medical and emergency response personnel join him, and Liz is rushed to the hospital. Meanwhile, police begin interviewing neighbors to try and find out exactly what transpired. Liz makes it to the hospital still breathing with a heartbeat. However, after surviving through the night, the following day on Saturday, January 26th, she succumbs to the gunshot wounds and passes away. Soon after, on the investigation side of the ordeal, authorities are quick to label the death a murder, as the crime scene suggests an execution-like shooting combined with the eyewitness testimony of the male subject who saw the killer flee. Within a matter of weeks, police canvass the Tombol suburbs for any and all security footage that may give them a better glimpse of what happened on January 25th at 6:52 a.m. One of the Barazza's neighbors then gives law enforcement a copy of their doorbell cam tape from that morning, the now infamous recording of Liz's final moments. In the coming days, detectives study the security footage and release it to media outlets, hoping someone will come forward to identify either the truck or the shooter. Tips pour in, but nothing substantial rises to the forefront of the case, a case growing colder by the minute. It wouldn't be for another year until the Barazza family finally receives a major update in the investigation. During a 1-year memorial held by family members, community members, and members of the 501st Legion in honor of Liz's life at the tail end of January 2020, reporters hear from a lead detective on the case that police have obtained a warrant that could lead them directly to the party responsible. There are no other details given, and the exact type of warrant is not revealed, whether it be an arrest warrant or an evidentiary warrant. Again, however, the leads stop there without any major announcement until June 30th, 2020. A breaking news bulletin reveals that police unveiled an additional nugget of information stemming from the CCTV footage capturing Liz's murder. Authorities announce after analyzing discernible audio from the recording, it can be said confidently that as the suspect approached Liz at 6:52 a.m., Liz could be heard saying good morning in response. It is not a major clue, but it does make detectives wonder if Liz didn't actually know the suspect as opposed to earlier theories. Sadly, that news alert on June 30th is the last piece of evidence the public has received in Liz Barazza's case. As of today, Liz's brutal murder remains unsolved. The investigation did undergo a change in top leadership, so that must be considered as to why there are apparently no sizable leads despite almost 2 years of sleuthing, as well as the global pandemic slowing down the world in general beginning in March of 2020. All that being said, police maintain that this case is still very much solvable and will continue to pursue any and all leads provided by the public or otherwise. Without a doubt, the biggest and really the only case point in the Barazza investigation is the CCTV security footage procured from around the crime scene by police in the direct aftermath of January 25th's senseless murder. The video shows the murder take place, albeit from a distant and grainy point of view. However, it also shows the suspect flee, and most importantly, the side profile of the Nissan Frontier Pro 4X driven by the shooter. Before I play the video in its entirety as first released by authorities, I want to be upfront about the disturbing nature of the footage. A figure with long hair, a long coat or robe, and what could be boots parks across the street from the Barazza residence, walks over to the front yard where Liz works on the garage sale sign, confronts her yard where Liz works on the garage sale sign, confronts her with 8 seconds of unknown dialogue, then shoots her 4 times at point-blank range before standing over her body and running off. The most contested part of the video is whether or not the shooter is a woman, as it might seem at first glance, or a man dressed to appear as a woman. It truly is hard to tell. Some point to the end of the video where the killer runs away, stating that the gait is most often attributed to the form of a female run. However, it is also widely believed that the killer was wearing boots as a part of their peculiar getup, and that may have changed the appearance of their movement. Nevertheless, we don't share this video to determine whether or not the killer was male, or female, or disguised, or in plain clothes. It's meant to spread awareness, and hopefully catch the eye of someone who hasn't seen it before, recognizing something that could be game-changing, a vital clue. If anything in this video rings a bell, even the slightest memory in the back of your mind, whether it be the identity of the shooter or the origin of the Nissan Frontier truck, contact Crime Stoppers at 713-222-TIPS. Let us now turn to the most prominent theories that attempt to explain the unsolved murder of Liz Barazza. Because of how recent the Liz Barazza murder case is, the theories surrounding it are few and far between. Both its recency and a withholding of most case details by law enforcement are to blame for this, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Police usually keep important clues and even pieces of evidence that don't seem relevant close to their chest in order to avoid tipping off the real suspects of their findings or threatening their chances of making an arrest. It's why studying cold cases within their first few years of investigation are so tricky. There simply isn't enough yarn to thread together a solid board of theories, at least not yet. However, there are still some ideas. One of the very early hypotheses speculated by case followers was that either Sergio or Liz was involved in a secret love triangle, and the shooter from the video is an enraged lover or person who was intimately involved with one of the members of the couple. However, we don't believe this is the case. Personal and melodramatic gossip often circulates after a murder, and it can be harmful to the Barazza family and disrespectful to the memory of Liz herself if presented without any real evidence. In fact, there is a very simple and straightforward observation regarding this theory that helps delegitimize it from rampant belief. If there was indeed a love triangle and a secret partner involved, there would be a paper trail, or at least a digital one. There would be emails or texts or some sort of communication remaining on a phone or a computer, a forgotten voicemail or letter, or something left over to make a connection. The absence of any evidence of this nature speaks for itself. It also shouldn't have to be said, but Sergio himself has been very clear and concise with police, and has fully cooperated with both law enforcement and the media. He has shown no signs he has something to hide, and until police uncover something to the contrary, we must focus on other possibilities than those that likely end up in a tabloid magazine. Of course, the shooter could be connected via a close relationship to either Liz or her husband, but to immediately point fingers towards a scandalous extramarital affair would be jumping the gun. Another commonly held belief about who the killer could be is that they met Liz somewhere at a comic book convention or similar cosplaying event, and for whatever reason, fixated on her with the intent to murder. But why or how could this happen? One explanation is the passion behind fan-based activities such as comic cons and other global events is normally brought to the absolute extreme. It regrettably doesn't take long when investigating some pastimes such as these to find there is a history of toxic fandom, misogyny, and elitism, certainly not in the majority, but that 1% is known to exist. Of course, cosplaying and passionate fandoms are a good thing, full of good people with good intentions, and are meant for escapism and passion, but there are cases where people have taken their favorite pop culture iconography a little too far, and that bad blood has been known in the past to spill over into nefarious and criminal territory. Thus, it is suggested that somewhere along their travels or even in an online community, Liz met someone who became overly jealous of her or Sergio, made advances, and when they didn't get what they wanted, went after her in the most horrific way possible. Now, while this is also somewhat unlikely to not have a trail of communication somewhere on the internet for police to track, it's possible this connection was made in person, and the killer was an unknown stalker following Liz around, and waiting for her to be alone. There have been confirmed cases of women being stalked at comic conventions before, and has even led to abuse and assaults. It is not a common occurrence, but it has happened frequently enough for some to consider it in connection with Liz's case. The biggest criticism to the cosplay-related stalker theory is how out of place the subject was in Tomball itself. The neighbors never reported seeing the Nissan Frontier truck in the housing complex prior to that night, and it wasn't recorded on CCTV cameras in the hours or days leading up to the murder. For the stalker to have been following Liz prior to the shooting, they would have had to track her movements covertly using a different vehicle, ensuring she would be alone at the right time. Since the garage sale was not widely advertised, the stalker wouldn't have known to target the neighborhood that morning. The idea of randomly showing up seems highly improbable, making it appear more like a planned attack rather than a stroke of luck. Additionally, some believe the stalker was wearing a disguise in the security footage, possibly with a long robe and wig to conceal their identity. This could suggest an attempt to hide their true appearance, though this conflicts with the typical behavior of a stalker, who usually operates from the shadows without the need for a disguise. This raises the possibility that the shooter wasn't just a random stalker, but someone with a personal connection to Liz, someone who knew about the garage sale. However, this would assume that investigators hadn't already compiled a list of everyone who knew about the sale and ruled them out. If they did this, it would be incredibly difficult for someone to slip through the cracks, unless the person was a friend or coworker who rented or borrowed the car. In that case, if the police searched for the specific Nissan Frontier Pro 4X model through car rentals in the area, the individual could potentially avoid detection, as there would be no records linking them to the vehicle. And while it seems perhaps overly elaborate for a killer to rent a car for use in a murder plot, keep in mind that many think the shooter was also wearing a disguise, the longer hair appearing more like a wig than a natural hairstyle. Of course, this is impossible to discern on such a low-quality camera feed and can neither be confirmed nor denied. But if the killer dressed up, they may also have used the car under someone else's name, knowing there could be many prying eyes identifying the make and model of their getaway vehicle. Overall, however, the idea that the killer was a personal friend is hard to make sense of when considering the most recent update from law enforcement regarding the first words spoken by Liz when the shooter approached her. An unexcited good morning that was described by law enforcement as a greeting someone would extend to a stranger or passerby doesn't give much credence to the thought that Liz knew her killer. Again, this loops back to the disguise theory. Liz simply may not have recognized her killer at first glance. We also must remember that it was just 6:50 in the morning in the very early phases of daylight. The shadows of twilight may have cloaked the face of the perpetrator. We also don't know what exactly the killer and Liz spoke about in the 8 seconds between good morning and gunfire. Once the killer got close, Liz may very well have realized who it was. The CCTV footage doesn't reveal any sign of alarm or attempt to flee by Liz, but the gunmen also drew their weapon quickly, allowing very little time to react. There are admittedly many holes with this theory, but it is also only one breakthrough or piece of evidence away from explaining everything. Sadly, for now, it is too vague to be counted on. The final theory most discussed by sleuths so far is that the shooter is a contract killer, someone who is hired by an associate or even a stalker of Liz's to kill her that fateful morning. This would explain all the irregularities of the video and the situation at large as we currently see them. A contract killer who has no connection to the Barazza household wouldn't be identified by Liz herself. The vehicle would not be traced to any of her family and friends, and they would have been given the garage sale information by whoever hired them or asked them to do such a terrible thing. Obviously, this depends on the idea that it was someone who knew about the garage sale that sealed Liz's fate, but the way that the perpetrator's truck drove around the neighborhood that morning makes us believe that they knew Liz would eventually be alone that day, understanding Sergio would go to work while Liz set up the supplies. There's even a hypothesized conversation to go with this theory, with some thinking that the 8-second conversation before the muzzle flashes, consisting of the killer asking if Liz was who she really was, if her garage sale was really a garage sale, and then firing the gun when Liz confirmed this. It should be noted that if the killer was hired by contract, they were by no means a professional assassin or had much experience in violent crime. Someone who murders with intent per contract surely wouldn't have been so obvious, would have used silencing techniques for maximum stealth, and most certainly wouldn't have done it wearing a pair of boots and a long flowing robe. There are of course thousands of characters around the country that might fit that bill, but a hired gunman likely isn't one of them. Is this by design another way to camouflage intent with ridiculousness? It can't be ruled out, but at this point, everything is still in play. Before we divulge our hypothesis of Liz Barazza's unsolved murder, we want to make known that our conclusions are purely logical speculation based on evidence, circumstance, and factual subtext. We are only privy to the same information presented in each episode, and we do not attempt to promise certainty or an expert guarantee on the findings we reach in closing. We simply observe, research, and report. In the case of Liz Barazza, we believe that she was in fact murdered by an associate, whether it be a coworker or someone she met at either a cosplaying convention or other fandom-related events. Who this could be, whether it was a male or female, is impossible to specify. However, we are confident that whoever it was committed murder due to an unsolved confrontation with Liz. It was someone who was silent in their wrath, but instead of sorting out whatever differences they may have had turned into a cold-blooded murderer to try and solve their problems. Whether the long hair was a wig or the robe and boots are disguised can't be proven at the moment, but it can be assumed that in those 8 seconds after Liz cautiously greeted them with a good morning, the killer laid out what they were about to do before firing the gun 4 times at point-blank range. Whoever the killer was then ran off, got rid of their vehicle when its description hit the rounds of local news, and either seamlessly embedded themselves back into society like nothing ever happened or dropped off the map completely. We also believe that whoever it was did know about the impending garage sale and used that to their advantage. They probably canvassed the Tomball suburbs previously, and maybe even visited the Barazza residence prior to January 25th to decode Sergio's movements and know the window in which to strike. It's all additional support to the fact that this was premeditated murder, not a whimsical dark fantasy born from someone's nightmare. Nobody just woke up one morning and decided to drive to southeastern Texas and kill an innocent young woman. This was no serial killer. This was no escaped convict. This was someone who chose with every fiber in their body to commit an evil act. They picked the red paint for the walls. They were not forced or held at gunpoint themselves, and therefore they shall be pursued as such as the cold-blooded killer they are, deserving of all the justice that is awaiting to befall them. There are not a lot of details to pour out into the world, but there is always the chance for more to come in. If you have absolutely any connection to Liz or Sergio, or may know something not yet expressed in this episode or other case coverages, we implore you to let the proper authorities know, so that the offender out there who is still running around in the dark is thrust into the light. Let us return to the moments described at the start of this episode, reflecting on the brilliant and beautiful way Liz Barazza lived until her final breath. While it may seem cliché, Liz truly embodied a life of charity and goodness. She never wavered in her determination to improve the world around her, leaving a lasting impact on everyone she encountered and ensuring their lives were enriched as well. She approached challenges with grace, dedicating herself to helping those in need with boundless generosity. Her work in the 501st Legion was a testament to her creative empathy and passionate imagination, serving as a reminder that it doesn't matter how others perceive us. If something brings you immeasurable joy, something not found elsewhere, hold on to it with all your heart. Ultimately, doing what we love and surrounding ourselves with hope-filled things will create the same environment for others. Liz was the epitome of her community, and as a community ourselves, we owe it to her memory to preserve the goodness she shared. We will honor Liz Barazza and, in doing so, continue to fight for answers, determined to unravel the mystery of why she was taken from the world, so that the Tomboll terror may finally be solved. Thanks for watching.